the largest numbers of Cubans immigrated to the U.S. However, Cuban immigration dates back to the 19th century. It is this immigration that set the foundation for future generations of immigrants. The first immigrants came as entrepreneurs, setting up commerce between the island and the U.S. with cigar factories owned and operated by Cubans within Key West and New York. Cuban businessmen and intellectuals traveled from their homeland to the U.S. and back for business and leisure, facilitating communication and familiarity among the two lands. With the onset of the First War for Cuban independence, these exiled elites left their homeland on a more permanent basis and found themselves in a now somewhat familiar land, continuing their financial ties and setting up communities around their businesses and intellectual associations. It is these communities that other Cubans of different socioeconomic standing would later join, their common interest in the politics of their homeland binding them. The first grave Cuban immigration is considered to have started around the mid-20th century, when the upper classes of Cuban society, threatened economically and politically more so than any other sector, came to the U.S. They were skilled and educated and proved to be most economically successful when compared to future waves, as well as politically involved in American foreign policy. With the second wave around 1965, those Cubans already established within the U.S. could come back to pick up their relatives. With orderly departure programs, applications were also taken for departure to the U.S. However, those granted permission to leave Cuba were hand-selected by the Cuban government. Therefore, it makes sense that those chosen were women and children. The men were left for military purposes. With these waves, both middle and working sectors arrived along with those of the upper. It was during this time that the greatest amount of immigrants came in. Still, in both ways of the governmental policies facilitated support, both for entrance into the country and establishment into the communities. The Mariel boat lifts at around 1980 marked the third wave and turning point of Cuban migration. U.S. immigration policy became much more restrictive because of the disorganized nature of the boat lifts themselves. Only relatives were supposed to board the boat, but anyone who came did. For the same reason, the demographic profile of the entrants was much more mixed, more representative of the Cuban population. Ultimately, the rafter crisis of 1994 upturned U.S. policy, permitting 20,000 Cubans a year to enter by the normal visa process. However, they were no longer given a refugee status. Thus, the experiences of Cubans within the U.S. can be generalized into two groups: those who are greeted by welcoming U.S. foreign policy and incorporated into their communities successfully economically, and those that were hindered not only by a lower socioeconomic standing in Cuba and subsequently in the U.S., but also by a less accepting U.S. naturalization policy.